Welcome to the National Environmental Policy Act, also known as NEPA Introductory Course, titled Coastal Barrier Resources, provided by the Florida Department of Transportation's, or FDOT's, Office of Environmental Management, or OEM. This training is part of a series of introductory courses that provides guidance on FDOT's process for complying with NEPA, called Project Development and Environment, or PD&E. Please see the Environmental Management Academy course catalog in the FDOT Learning Curve or the OEM website PD&E Training Track for other trainings in this series. Please note, links to all references mentioned in this training will be provided on the last slide. The purpose of this course is to provide instruction on analysis, coordination, and documentation of project impacts to Florida's coastal barrier resources. Please note, you may pause this training at any time. This training has 3 lessons. In Lesson 1, we'll define coastal barrier resources. In Lesson 2, we'll cover the process for determining if coastal barrier resource provisions apply to a project. And in Lesson 3, we'll discuss documentation in the environmental document. We'll now proceed to Lesson 1. What are coastal barrier resources? The Coastal Barrier Resources process is guided by Part 2, Chapter 15 of the PD&E Manual. This chapter provides an overview of coastal barrier resources and explains the procedure for conducting coordination and documentation. You may want to have this chapter handy as you go through this training. This chapter is available on FDOT's OEM website using the link at the bottom of this slide. Coastal barrier resources are designated undeveloped coastal barriers and their associated aquatic habitat, including wetlands, marshes, estuaries, inlets, and nearshore waters. The U.S. Department of the Interior has established a coastal barrier resource system, creating designated units protected by the Coastal Barrier Resources Act. Undeveloped coastal barriers are depositional geologic features which are comprised of unconsolidated sedimentary material. They are subject to wave, tidal, and wind energies and protect landward aquatic habitats from direct wave attack. They include all associated aquatic habitats, including the adjacent wetlands, marshes, estuaries, inlets, and nearshore waters, but only if such features and associated habitats contain few man-made structures, and these structures and people's activities associated with them do not significantly impede geomorphic and ecological processes. Types of coastal barriers include bay barrier, coastal barriers that connect 2 headlands and enclose a pond, marsh, or other aquatic habitat. Tombolos, which are sand or gravel beaches connected to offshore islands, to each other, or to a mainland. Barrier spits, which are coastal barriers extending into open water attached to mainland at one end. And barrier islands, coastal islands completely detached from mainland. Coastal barrier resources are protected from development and are prohibited from federal expenditures according to the Coastal Barrier Resources Act of 1982, which was later amended by the Coastal Barrier Improvement Act of 1990. The goals of these acts are to 1, minimize the loss of human life by discouraging development in high-risk areas. 2, reduce wasteful expenditure of federal resources. And 3, protect the natural resources associated with coastal barriers. The Coastal Barrier Resources Act is only applicable to federal funded projects. Coastal barrier resources protections do not apply to state environmental impact reports or non-major state actions. Otherwise protected areas, called OPAs, are an established category of undeveloped coastal barriers within the boundaries of lands reserved as wildlife refuges, parks, or areas for other conservation purposes. New construction with OPAs cannot receive federal flood insurance unless it conforms to the purposes for which the area is protected. No other restrictions are placed on federal expenditures in these areas. Therefore, the federal funding prohibitions of the Coastal Barrier Resources Act do not apply to these areas. Now let's begin Lesson 2, where we will discuss the process of determining if coastal barrier resource provisions apply to a project. In order to determine if the provisions apply, review Coastal Barrier Resource System unit maps to see if the project is in the vicinity of or leads directly to a designated coastal barrier resource unit that's not identified as an OPA. These maps are available as data layers in the environmental screening tool called the EST. The EST can be utilized even if the project was not screened in the Efficient Transportation Decision-Making, or ETDM, process. Maps are also available from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service website. If the project is in the vicinity of or leads directly to one of these units, then review the federal funding provisions and exceptions to see if the project can receive federal funds. Any form of federal loan, grant, guarantee, insurance, payment, rebate, subsidy, or any form of direct or indirect federal assistance for development in designated coastal barrier units are prohibited by the Coastal Barrier Resources Act, as well as the construction or the purchase of 1. Structures, appurtenance, facilities, or related infrastructure. 2. Roads, airports, boat landing facilities, or other facilities. 3. Bridges or causeways leading to any coastal barrier resource system unit. And 4. Assistance for erosion control or stabilization of any inlet, shoreline, or inshore area, except in certain emergencies. Exceptions for coastal barrier resource provisions can be found in Section 6 of the Coastal Barrier Resources Act, which is in 16 U.S.C. Section 3505. A federal expenditure is allowable within the coastal barrier resource system units if it meets any of the following exceptions: maintenance or construction of improvements to existing federal navigational channels, including the intracoastal waterway, and related structures such as jetties, including disposal of dredge materials related to such maintenance or construction. The maintenance, replacement, reconstruction, or repair, but not the expansion, of publicly owned or publicly operated roads, structures, or facilities that are essential links in a larger network or system. Construction, operation, maintenance, and rehabilitation of U.S. Coast Guard facilities and access to them. A federal expenditure is also allowable within coastal barrier resource system units if it meets any of the following exceptions and is also consistent with the 3 goals of the Coastal Barrier Resources Act. These exceptions include projects for the study, management, protection, and enhancement of fish and wildlife resources and habitats, including acquisition of fish and wildlife habitats and related lands, stabilization projects for fish and wildlife habitats, and recreational projects. Also, scientific research, including aeronautical, atmospheric, space, geologic, marine, fish and wildlife, and other research, development, and applications. Maintenance, replacement, reconstruction, or repair, but not the expansion, except for U.S. Highway 1 in the Florida Keys, of publicly owned or publicly operated roads, structures, or facilities. All highways on the federal network are essential links in a larger network or system. And lastly, non-structural projects for shoreline stabilization that are designed to mimic, enhance, or restore a natural stabilization system. Projects that qualify for an exception cannot proceed with federal funding until they've undergone an interagency consultation as contained in advisory guidelines outlined in the Federal Register. This includes U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service comment prior to federal funding approval. Consultations only required if the project is in the vicinity or leads directly to a coastal barrier resources system unit. Now, this coordination takes place during the PD&E phase. Note that consultation is not required for areas identified as OPAs. During the PD&E phase, the ETDM Programming Screen Summary Report is reviewed for Environmental Technical Advisory Team, or ETAC, comments in the coastal and marine issue. The screening results should identify if the project is in the vicinity or leads directly to a coastal barrier resource system unit. The district will prepare a transmittal letter that includes the NEPA assignment standard statement shown here. The letter should include a project description and map showing the project location in relation to the coastal barrier resource system unit. This information is sent to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's local field office and ETAP member. Contact information is provided in Part 2, Chapter 15 of the PD&E Manual. We will now proceed to Lesson 3 to discuss documentation in the environmental document. Documentation in Type 2 categorical exclusions, or CEs, environmental assessments called EAs, and environmental impact statements, or EISs, is necessary if the project is subject to the consultation requirements of the Coastal Barrier Resources Act. For projects along coastal areas where the provisions of the Act could apply, but the appropriate review has taken place and it's been determined that there is no coastal barrier resource system unit involvement, add the following or similar statement to the Coastal Barrier Resources section of the environmental document accordingly. It has been determined that this project is neither in the vicinity of nor leads directly to a designated coastal barrier resource unit pursuant to the Coastal Barrier Resources Act of 1982 and the Coastal Barrier Improvement Act of 1990. For Type 2 CEs, briefly summarize the consultation process and final determination in the Type 2 categorical exclusion determination form as appropriate based on the outcome of the consultation. The correspondence and other documents developed during the consultation process should be contained in the project file in SWEPT. It is recommended that these documents be placed within the Coastal Barrier Resources folder within SWEPT. For EAs and EISs, summarize the consultation and final determination in the Coastal Barrier Resources section. Correspondence and other documentation are referenced and included in the appendix. The Office of Environmental Management maintains a central library of training materials as well as documents and publications, including manuals, handbooks, guidelines, and agreements. Key references pertinent to this training include the Environmental Management Academy course catalog, which is in FDOT's Learning Curve and is also available through the OEM PD&E training track on OEM's website. Other resources include the PD&E Manual, ETDM Manual, the FDOT Procedural Document Library, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Coastal Barrier Resource Systems website.